Welcome to Diplomatic Channel. I am Amarachi Ubani. What a week of mourning we've been through. The world mourning victims of terror attacks from Nigeria to Tunisia to Kuwait, and this is happening as Muslims around the world observe the Ramadan fast, a holy period for many of them. And yet some heartless people have no fear of God in them, the God that they worship, and have decided to carry out these vicious acts regardless of the season. Here in Nigeria, Boko Haram carried out at least 3 attacks this past week in northeastern Nigeria, killing scores of people altogether. According to the U.S. State Department, Boko Haram has killed about 8,239 people since it began insurgent attacks in the country. And on Friday, 3 terrorist attacks happened in 3 different countries around the world. In France, where workers at a U.S. gas company southeast of the country found a decapitated head along with a flag bearing Islamic inscriptions. Remember, this is happening less than 6 months after the other terror attacks on staff at Charlie Hebdo magazine and a Jewish food store. Now in Kuwait, a suicide bomber blew himself up inside a packed Shiite mosque in Kuwait City during Friday prayers, killing more than 25 people, the first of this kind of attack in the country. While in Tunisia, which also happened on Friday, an attack on a popular resort in the country, leaving 38 people dead, 36 more wounded. We're hearing that 15 of the dead were mainly British. It's the second major attack on tourists in the country since March, when 22 people were killed, most of them foreigners, at Bardo Museum in the capital, Tunis. One Tunisian man has been arrested on suspicion that he was part of the attack on the beachside resort in Sousse. President Beji Caid Essebsi said the country is now in a war against terrorism, a war that does not only concern the police or the army that, quote, paid the higher price and was often targeted. He said the Tunisian people as a whole are now involved. As former Nigerian President Goodluck Jonathan and President Muhammadu Buhari have said, terrorism is a global problem. The U.S. says there is no evidence that these attacks, the one in France, Kuwait and in Tunisia, were coordinated, but the Islamic State has claimed responsibility for the attacks in Kuwait and in Tunisia. So those two are connected, but we're still quite unsure about the one in France. Now, ISIS has never claimed responsibility for the attacks in France. The authorities have always been committed by people with extremist views. But on the program this week, Greece remains the sick man of Europe as Eurozone finance ministers reject the country's request to extend a bailout program beyond June 30. Greece's failing economy could affect the Eurozone economies and, in turn, the world. There's growing fear without new funds, the country's economy could collapse. Then, what is South Africa to do following the controversy of Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir's presence in the country for the African Union Summit? President Jacob Zuma has been deep in thought over South Africa's membership of the International Criminal Court. But up ahead, British High Commissioner Andrew Pocock is retiring from diplomatic service. He talks to us about his 3-year stay in Nigeria and where he goes from here. You're watching Diplomatic Channel. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Last week, Greece's Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras proposed a deal to the Eurozone finance ministers in their meeting in Brussels, hoping to raise a new bailout for the country. By the end of the week, nothing had been decided until Saturday, when the Eurogroup released a statement saying Greece had broken off negotiations over a new bailout deal unilaterally.
Eurozone finance ministers on Saturday refused to approve extending the bailout for Greece after the government rejected tough lender demands and voted on the bailout deal. 18 finance ministers meeting for the first time without Greece said no to extending an expiring bailout until a referendum scheduled for July the 5th, meaning Greece's economy could default on a €1.6 billion IMF loan. But the country's finance minister has not given up hope. Mr. Yanis Varoufakis says he would still try to secure a bailout that could then be put to a referendum. He blamed the international lenders for making what he called an inadequate proposal that his government could not accept. Greece still has a lifeline. According to the head of the International Monetary Fund, Ms. Christine Lagarde, the July 5th referendum will relate to proposals and arrangements which are no longer valid. If there was a resounding yes for Greece to remain in the Eurozone, then countries would work with Greece. That may be hard, though, considering Greece's Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras walked out of the negotiations on Friday.
South Africa is considering pulling out of the International Criminal Court because of controversy generated by Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir's presence in the country for the African Union Summit 2 weeks ago. And as party to the Rome Statute, the country was obligated to arrest President Bashir because of the ICC warrant against him. Instead, the South African government and the African Union chose to protect Mr. Bashir until he left.
South Africa is not necessarily between a rock and a hard place over Omar al-Bashir, the Sudanese president. But as AU chairman Robert Mugabe said at the end of the AU summit in Johannesburg, it has been having deep thoughts over its membership of the International Criminal Court.
Those of them who signed the treaty are now regretting. We didn't sign it, Zimbabwe we said no, we don't submit ourselves to justice outside our country. What for?
The country faced calls by right groups which felt South Africa had a duty to hand over al-Bashir. The government ignored a court ruling to arrest the Sudanese president and had to respond to the court's request on how President Bashir had left the country.
As a court of law, we are obviously the wrong forum for the ventilation of regional and international policy considerations, which, as we say above, were not ventilated before us. We, however, find it prudent to invite the ICC to take cognizance of the issues that arise in this matter.
It seems the president has had enough of being queried and considering what one of his ministers says is a last report.
South Africa may, as a last resort, also consider withdrawing from the ICC. Such a decision will only be taken when South Africa has exhausted all the remedies available to it.
South Africa's response to the situation breaches its obligation to the Rome Statute to execute al-Bashir's arrest. It also highlights a major problem with the International Criminal Court, the lack of cooperation among member states, and the lack of its own enforcement mechanism. It does seem like until these issues are tackled, the Sudanese president and other African leaders indicted or who may be indicted by the court may continue to work as free men.
Coming up after the break, we're still in Women of Excellence fever at the AU Summit. One of the awardees, Dr. Juliet Twakli, talks to us about her projects and the road to success. Please stay with us.